because my older sister took French, and I figured that if I ever needed help, she would be available. Overall, the experience was pretty boring, except on the days when Stacy entered the room. She didn't take French. Stacy was a statuesque brunette with olive-colored skin. She was gorgeous, and I would just stare at her. To this day, I have no idea what her voice sounds like, because I never had the guts to just get out of my seat and talk to her. It didn't stop there. There was another girl named Lauren who actually flirted with me. I know, I was surprised too. I was completely unaware about what it is that she actually meant, and so I just failed to seize that opportunity. I failed to just take a chance, and that's what I'm here to tell you to do. And it's not a new message. Carpe diem, life in every breath. YOLO! Regardless of the language or the culture from which these messages originated, their meaning is essentially the same. Make the most out of every opportunity and live life to the fullest. Life is wondrous and beautiful, and it's amazingly complex, to the point where it seems almost like a hodgepodge of chaos. And in order to make more sense out of this chaos, we often create daily routines. Everything from as simple as eating our meals at about the same time, to setting alarms, to more complicated ones like, say, a business plan or a vacation itinerary. Over time, these routines start to become habits, and they define our lives through their banality. And that's kind of the problem with them. They become comfortable. A comfort zone is regular, it's safe, it's ordinary. And maybe at first it makes us very happy because we feel protected. But according to the law of diminishing returns, it's not going to keep us at the same level of happiness for very long. I like having eggs for breakfast, but if you told me that I would have to have eggs every day for breakfast for the rest of my life, I can assure you that I'd be less than enthused after a few weeks, let alone a few days, or a few years rather. If you don't want to make any changes in your life, you're probably saying one of these things to yourself right now. And what you're really saying, if we translate these phrases, is that I feel comfortable. I feel safe. It's like waking up in a really comfortable bed. The alarm goes off, you hit the snooze bar, and you roll back over and go to sleep. You don't want to get up. The problem is, if you don't get up, you don't get anything done. And that's the problem with the comfort zone. It makes us feel complacent. We stop seeking to achieve more and just protect what we have. And that may not seem too bad right now until you realize that what it means is that right now, this very moment, is the most that you will ever have and the best that your life will ever be. Take a really long look at your life right now and tell yourself that for the next 5, 10, or 20 years, nothing is going to get substantially better. Now ask yourself, are you okay with that? Then again, there are going to be those among us who just feel a little bit scared about taking risks. We don't really want to venture outside that comfort zone. Research shows us that this comes from a variety of different places. Whether or not we see some of those opportunities and experiences and we just have a hunch that it's going to turn out wrong, or maybe it's based on a previous experience that we've had. Or maybe we're just concerned about what our decisions or choices and how they're going to affect other people. Ultimately, all of these things boil down to one really root cause: fear. We're afraid of the unknown. And so we avoid risks. And I'd like to talk about a couple of the rationalizations that we tell ourselves in order to make avoiding those risks seem okay. The first of which is this thing called ambiguity aversion. We're faced with a couple of different options, and we choose the one that seems familiar. We know exactly what's going to happen. We willfully blind ourselves to the new options, and instead focus on only what we've already seen and already experienced, and tell ourselves it's probably the better choice. The anchoring effect is very similar. After we've made that initial choice, even when things don't seem to be going as well as we might have anticipated them, we're reluctant to change and choose the other choice or switch our directions because we rationalize that any change of direction is already a loss and therefore not the best outcome. To give you an example of this risk-averse behavior, I often play a very simple game with my students that's based on the game show, Let's Make a Deal. I show them 3 cards, and only one of them is a winning outcome. And I ask them, of course, to pick a card, any card. After the student in question has made their decision, I show them one of the cards that they didn't pick, which of course is a losing option. And then I ask them, would you like to change your original choice? Now the math is very clear on this. Because you have more information now, it's actually in your best interest to switch. But you'd be surprised just how many students say, no thanks, I'm going to stick with the one I picked in the very beginning. Taking risks and making changes can be a scary proposition though. All right? It innately takes us out of our comfort zone and places us in new situations and new scenarios. In order to mitigate the fear that we might associate with those new situations, it's important for us to kind of break down the kinds of events or choices that we might face in our daily lives. The first of which are these things called known knowns. These are situations that we've been in time and again. We pretty much know exactly what's going to happen. It's very easy for us to make predictions about them. The second one are slightly more unfamiliar. We know about them because we've seen other people do these things. Maybe we've read about them, or we've heard about how people handle this type of situation. We've never been in that situation ourselves, so we can kind of create a model that would help us to make that predictive choice, but we haven't actually experienced it yet. The last one is something that's completely unfamiliar to us. Maybe we lack the imagination to conceive of those actually being options. Or maybe we just don't have enough information to provide us with all of the available choices. And so it's virtually impossible for us to make predictions about how that's going to turn out. That last category that I mentioned is by far the biggest. There's always going to be things that we simply don't know. And in this larger category are also events known as black swan events. Think of something as terrible as, say, a natural disaster, like a hurricane or an earthquake, or something similarly that would uproot nearly every facet of your life. When we start to fixate on these kind of horrible events, it innately terrifies us, and it causes us to shrink back into our comfort zone and just to maintain the status quo. And so the last rationalization that I'd like to talk about is the status quo bias. As you can imagine, the status quo bias is one where we seek to just maintain what's going on right now. If we're faced with a choice, we're going to pick the same one that we've always picked. We'd rather handle the mistakes that we've made in the past rather than make new mistakes. It's easier for us to plan for what those decisions are going to end up in, and if they do happen to be the slightly wrong path, or even ones that result in slightly disfavorable outcomes, we know how to mitigate those results in order to lead us in the right direction. We avoid making new mistakes because what we're really afraid of is failure. Nobody wants to be seen as a failure or even as being wrong. But I would argue that even failures that we make today are seen as just temporary setbacks in the long run on the road to future success. To give you an example, when I was younger, my mom would often try her hand at making a banana cream pie. Now, if you've never tried this, it's like a mousse-like consistency that has freshly cut bananas in it, a warm, flaky crust. Maybe there's even whipped cream on top with a meringue. It's delicious. I highly recommend you try this. However, my mother was terrible at this, and she failed virtually every single time. But I can tell you right now that she has made some of the best banana cream soup ever. To further cement my point, I would say that taking that risk, whatever it is actually the net positive that we're looking for in the long run. Why? Well, even when we do fail, we end up learning new things about ourselves and the world around us, which would ultimately lead to something more successful in the long run. Even in failure, we learn. To give you a real-world example, I'd like to take a look at these two gentlemen. Unsatisfied with the business that they had in the bicycle world, they sought to do something that nobody else had ever accomplished before. There was no blueprint for them to follow. There was no steps for them to pursue. They simply had to figure it out as they went along. Now, not every attempt that they made was successful. But they took what they learned from each of those failures and they applied them and eventually found an environment in North Carolina that worked out. And that's why I'm talking to you in China, even though I wasn't born here. Despite what you might be thinking at this point, I'm not advocating that you take every single risk that's available to you. That would be lunacy. Instead, what you need to do is actually map out how it is that you're going to achieve the little goals or larger goals that we set forth for ourselves in our life. We need to have a strategy. First, we need to examine specific aspects of our life that we'd like to improve and ask ourselves, why do we want to improve that? Maybe you're not being challenged enough in your job or in school. And so you need to achieve that challenge or that environment that does push you so that you grow as both a person or a teacher. You need to determine what kind of comfort level we have with the goal as well. Is a very small improvement going to be something that satisfies you, or do you need something much larger? If you're not being challenged in your current job, maybe you're considering that you need to start a whole new vocation. In which case, you'd have to basically remove everything that you have now and completely start over. But if you achieve the challenge that you're looking for, perhaps that's actually the best course of action. After you decide to take that chance, you need to make yourself aware of indicators of success or failure. If you're on the right track, if you can identify things that would actually encourage you, it's going to just push you forward. Conversely, if you're on the wrong path and you can recognize that, well, perhaps you can make an adjustment and steer yourself in the right direction. Or, worst case scenario, you establish, hey, maybe this isn't the right time for me to be making this risk. Maybe you'll come back to it later. But even so, you have achieved new information which can help you in that pursuit. You need to be aware of the impact that your decision or your choices have on other people. To some extent, depending on what risk you're looking at, this may be more or less important. And if you're married and you decide you need a whole new job, you might want to consult that other person. I'm standing here today because I made a very similar choice. About 20 years ago, I was on the fast track to becoming a prosecutor. It was everything that I thought I wanted to be at that time. Until I sat for the LSAT, and I was doing a reasonably good job. I had plenty of extra time, and unfortunately that extra time allowed me to contemplate just what my life would be like, and I hated it. Luckily, at that time I had just started a part-time job where I was teaching. And I realized that this is exactly what I wanted. Now, it cost me all of my life savings at that time. The girlfriend that I had thought it was a terrible decision, and she left me. My father thought it was horrible, and to this day probably thinks that it's a terrible mistake. But I still think of it as the best decision I've ever made. And that's the exact kind of philosophy that I'm encouraging you and that you need to have here. After you decide that you're going to make that risk, you need to embrace it. You need to be happy with whatever happens, good or bad. Because ultimately, it's your life. And by taking that risk, you're taking control of your life. And you'll realize that after you make this decision, that it's the only way that you're going to learn and grow as a person. Because how else can you expect things to get better if you don't try something different? I guess what I'm really trying to get at here is that after you make all these risks and you're able to kind of grow as a person, you'll find that your comfort zone will start to slowly expand. Not only with the new experiences that you've engaged in, but also the way that it shaped you and the people around you. So I'm encouraging you in your daily life to make all of those risks that you think are necessary, to step out of your comfort zone, to keep pushing yourself forward. And in the end, maybe you'll end up with a decision that you think was the best one that you've ever made also. Thank you.